Hello and welcome. This is Anthony Parent, tax attorney. I'm managing partner here at Parent and Parent LLP, the IRS Medic. And the webinar today is Understanding the Mad World of Federal Tax Liens. With me on the seminar today is attorney Tom Groth, and he will be answering questions as they come up in the chat box. And he will try to notify me of pressing ones, but I might not be able to get to those, address those. Tom will try to get to those, and if you can't, you could email me directly at aepirsmedic.com for any federal tax lien questions that you have. With that, let's get started. Who is this webinar for? Well, it is for CPAs, attorneys, taxpayers looking for some understanding about what can and can't be done about the growing problem of IRS federal tax liens. This is not an advanced class. We're going to try to keep it as basic as possible. So some of the nuances we do have to strip down a little bit. And this is about IRS liens, not levies and garnishments. And that's one key distinction. A lien is a claim against a property. A levy or garnishment is something that actually takes the property. And we know these are some legal terms, and sometimes it does confuse people not knowing the difference. The IRS does levy, and that's a separate thing. And hopefully I'll be able to get to a webinar on some of the aspects of that. So what is a federal tax lien? Well, one of the strange things is that, the federal tax lien here is something that's created by statute, not by common law. So Congress is able to write the law exactly how they want. And would you believe that everybody here, if you're a taxpayer, you actually have a federal tax lien against you right now, no matter who you are. If you made money in 2013, you have a federal tax lien. In fact, the second you make $1, the IRS has a claim to some of that money because you owe taxes or potentially owe taxes. So that tax liens exist between you and the IRS the moment you earn the income that resulted in the tax. So if you have a federal tax lien, you're in good company. So does every other taxpayer. Now, what is this federal tax lien about? What is it? Why? Strike that. Why are tax liens so bad? Well, it's actually the notice of federal tax lien that is the issue. Because the typical federal tax lien is a secret lien. Because yes, I have that as a taxpayer, I have a lien between me and the IRS, but nobody else knows about it. That's our personal business. So what happens is when you don't pay a tax bill, the IRS files a notice of tax lien to alert everybody in the entire world that you have a tax bill that you didn't pay. And this is what's strange is the IRS sends you a notice that a notice of lien has been filed in the land records or county courthouse. In the Northeast, we have land records, and then down south, it will be in the county courthouse. But what the IRS does is actually file the lien and then simultaneously alert that you have a lien. Some sort of kind of a scary thing that they don't have to ask your permission first. They'll do it and then let you know about it. And then what they'll do is that that all the credit reporting agencies pick up on this notice of federal tax lien, and then so do some of the scam artists that we'll be talking about in a little bit. Now, how is a federal tax lien different? It is not like a judgment lien. A judgment lien is if you get sued and somebody gets a lien and they attach it against your property, that takes quite a bit of work, and it attaches to that property. There'll be a property description. Federal tax lien has no such property description. It doesn't really attach to the property. It attaches to a property if somebody happens to own property in that same town. But if you own property, let's say that you happen to live in somewhere in Oregon, and the IRS files a tax lien against you in Florida, well, that tax lien actually doesn't apply to your Oregon property unless the IRS also files its federal tax lien against you in Oregon. But judgment lien is only specific to the property. Again, IRS tax lien is not. Now, one of the other big differences is that IRS tax lien is self-releasing. that means you don't necessarily need to get a release of the lien in order for it to go away. If you look on a tax lien, you'll actually see a date that says last date to refile. Well, that's the date that the tax lien becomes no effect. Now, if you ask the IRS to release that lien, even though it's what's known as stale dated, most likely they won't. In some cases they will, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other difference between an IRS tax lien versus, say, a property tax lien is that a property tax lien is super priority. That means if you don't pay your property taxes, the town or city will file a lien, and that will become the number one priority. That means if you don't pay your tax bill, your town or city can foreclose against your property, regardless of what other mortgage is, regardless of what other things are on there. Whereas a notice of federal tax lien is just going to sit wherever it sits in the priority. So that means that it comes after the town taxes. It comes after a first or second mortgage if it's on there. So that a notice of federal tax lien in many cases are filed where there's actually zero equity. And the IRS doesn't quite care about that. They're going to file them anyway. Now, what is some of the damage the federal tax lien can do? Well, this is what we've seen. It will lower your credit score 100 points. And that will drive up your borrowing costs, making it more difficult to pay back the IRS, or making it impossible. Okay, another thing it could do is frustrate employment. A lot of employers do background checks now. And if all else things being equal, there's one employee with a tax lien and one without, they'll certainly go for the employee without a tax lien. What some of the other things, higher life insurance premiums. Believe it or not, if you have a tax lien against you, you're considered more of a risk than somebody who doesn't. Then one of the more frustrating thing is you get a lot of junk mail and cold calls from scam resolution companies, and we'll be talking about some of those in a little bit. So what? Okay, all this damage. So why does the IRS do this? Why are they hurting people who are already in tough situation? Well, this is the best way to explain it, and I've had a lot of conversations with revenue officers about this, and they pretty much agree with me on this, is that the IRS felt that lien filing was far too discretionary, that revenue officers were giving certain taxpayers a break by not filing liens, and meanwhile punishing others. So the IRS had a neat solution to this. Let's treat everybody equally horribly. So they just said, there's no discretion, revenue officer. We don't care. We're just going to file lien. You have to file a lien whether you like to or not. And so that sort of stance, it's easy to do, and it shows a toughness. It's some of these zero tolerance policies that take away all discretion of the people who are supposed to use discretion. And our argument is if that's what we're doing, why are we paying people that much? Because this is something that could easily be done by a computer program. Just file a lien in every case. That's a little bit of an aside. And again, the revenue officers are not the ones who set this policy. They just have the marching orders, and it's something they hate to do because it makes their job a lot harder. This policy is based because it's ignorance on how the real world works. The vast majority of people who owe money to the IRS aren't sitting on assets and living a luxurious life. Most people are hurting, and if they even have a substantial income, there's so many other bills that they're far behind that a lien does very little, very, very little to actually secure the IRS interests. And our taxpayer advocate, Nina Olson, she's fantastic about this, and she has some great YouTube blogs, and maybe Tom can link some of those. But unfortunately, she doesn't get to set the rules. This is something that she's all fired up about because it just doesn't make any sense. It's not good for the IRS. It's not good for taxpayers. It's not good for our struggling economy. However, this is what's going on now. Now, on top of that, we have all these illustrious people out there scamming people, filled with the fear and ignorance from a tax lien. And if you owe a lot of money, you're going to have some bad days, and some days are going to be worse. And maybe one of these days, they're going to send you junk mail, or they're going to maybe cold call you, and they might say something to you that just sounds so believable, and you want to trust somebody to get this problem behind you, and it sounds so good, and so you hire them. And you against your better judgment, but you just needed somebody to trust. Well, this is some of the things you need to know, is that some of these salespeople from these tax firms, and a lot of them were shut down, and they all sort of, many of them operated in slightly different manners, but their salespeople could get up to 20% commissions for every case that they sold. And then once you pay the salesperson, you're never going to talk to them again. The file just goes somewhere else to some centralized place where it's sort of difficult to get in touch with whoever is in charge. And it's going to be handed to, resolution staff who has no idea what was promised. And, these people are quite effective. And, I know this from personal experience. I've actually sat in on some calls. I had, this is a true story. A client of mine, we knew a federal tax lien was going to be filed against him. And sure enough, one of these firms calls him at work. And he couldn't quite hear them, who it was. He thought it was somebody from the IRS, actually. And so he told them to give me a call. And then I picked up the phone and I started talking to this person who I actually thought was a hard money lender that we were looking for. But as a person went on, I realized, I said, wait a second, you're not a hard money lender. And they said no. They identified that they were from Colorado and that they were experts in the resolution of taxes, and in fact tax liens. And so I played along. I said, well, okay, sure. What can you do for my client? And they said, well, a federal tax lien was filed for about $200,000 and I said, okay. And this is actually an amount my client agreed he actually owed. So I said, and so she said, well, we could cut that in half. I said, you can cut it in half no matter what? I said, that's just the taxes. That's not even the penalties. She goes, oh, well, you can cut it in half. It's your rights. I said, well, how is it to my rights? I said, what rights are they? And she said, well, it's your rights. She put me on hold and she came back. She goes, it's your state rights. And I said, state rights, but this is a federal tax lien. I said, why would the IRS file a lien that was that was double what I really owed? And she went on to say that it was just my rights. And I think at this point she realized that she had someone who knew what she was talking about. I proceeded to give her a lecture, which she most likely ignored. And that was one experience. The other experience I have is a lot of the cold calls that you could be getting from people. They actually, the person making the cold call is paid an amount of money, a fixed amount of money. It could be anywhere between $100 to $200 whenever they transfer your call to somebody to one of these resolution places. Now, I've seen some of the scripts. I've seen the inside of these places. And sort of what they do is they railroad you into signing up for one of their things. It's all down to a script. It's all down to a science, a pretty sickening science. And unfortunately, it's really not based in reality. The people aren't qualified to talk about what they're talking about. And unfortunately, that is sort of the nature of this, is because it's so complicated. How are you to know, who's legitimate or not? And that's why that's one of the big reasons why I have this. So you could tell, immediately who, if someone says something to you, whether or not that's possible to be done or not done. Because trust me, there is a lot that can be done with tax liens. There we go. A happy little cloud. I want to talk about lien withdrawals, subordination, and discharge. Now, here's the deal. If the IRS thinks that there's something in it for them, like more money each month, they're going to work with you. Okay? So if you're looking to refinance, modify, do a short sale. Okay? Well, isn't that going to reduce the amount of money you're spending each month? Now, if you reduce that amount of money each month, doesn't that free up some money to pay the IRS? So isn't it that in their best interest to remove the lien so the deal can go through? Okay? That is the essence of the lien work. When we look at all of it, it's always something that we're offering to the IRS to say this deal is really in your best interest. One exception is if the IRS makes a mistake. Well, you don't have to show it's in their best interest. You could just ask for a lien withdrawal. And another one is when there's our, all right, thumbs up, right on. And the other is where there's a certificate of no interest. Here's my hypothetical for you. Let's say Dan and Dan Smith live at 101 Honeypot Way. Dan Smith has a lien filed against him. Dan Smith does not. Dan Smith wants to sell his house. Can Dan Smith do so? Well, the answer is maybe. Which Dan Smith are we talking about? So many times when there's double names in a town, that the IRS won't close because they think a federal tax lien is against one Dan Smith when it's not. It's against the other one. So what you could do is ask the IRS to submit a certificate of no interest, because just because a tax lien is filed with your name on it doesn't mean it applies to you. And just because a tax lien is filed to your address, and I was saying this before, just because a tax lien is filed to your address, a property you own, does not mean it applies to that property. The typical case is if a tenant of yours gets a tax lien filed against them. Well, the IRS is going to mail that tax lien to their residence, the apartment, but it doesn't attach. And also, you'll see this a lot, the IRS mails tax liens to P.O. boxes. Well, the lien doesn't attach to the P.O. box. So that's one of the key distinctions, is that just because the lien is sent to an address does not necessarily mean it applies to that address. Now, one of the other ways is that, if you lose your job, and how can you afford to pay the IRS anything? Okay. Now, this is what we see with brokers, those with licenses, government contractors, fund managers, high-profile employees. Okay, if they get a federal tax lien, that's it. They lose their high-paying job. So it's really not in the IRS's interest to have this lien out there. So what we'll look to do is get the lien withdrawal or put in an agreement to make sure a lien is never filed. Now, in order to make this happen, we're going to have a repayment agreement. And then here's the challenge, okay? It's got to be a payment agreement that's going to be high enough the IRS will accept, okay, but low enough that you can afford it without running up a new tax bill. And that's really always the needle we're attempting to thread. It's easy to get, anybody can get into installment agreement. I mean, that's pretty easy, but will it work? That's sort of the more difficult issue. Now, one of the other things is you can settle it with an offer in compromise. That this is one way that you can get rid of a tax lien without paying in full. Now, one of the things is bankruptcy can be a great solution to a tax problem. It is fantastic, and I do see that there are tax resolution firms, and some of these scammers will tell you that bankruptcy is not a solution, and that's not true. And they're saying that so that you'll hire them, not a bankruptcy attorney. And in all honesty, I am not a bankruptcy attorney. I don't make any money from it, but I will tell you that it can be a really, really great way out of a tax problem. And if that is something that is best for a client, you better believe I'm going to recommend that to them. But there is some issues with the bankruptcy. While you can get rid of the underlying debt, believe it or not, that lien may still be out there. And this is sort of a very, very complicated area of law where some of my friends get into Chapter 13 lien stripping, and some have been successful. I've been watching the changes in the law, and depending on where you live. So it's just something to be aware of. The liens may still be out there against property. So that's just something that if you're filing bankruptcy, usually it's best if you don't have any equity in any property. Now, if you do settle with an offer in compromise and it gets accepted, the lien comes off once the offer in compromise is accepted and paid in full. And usually it takes us about 2 months, 2-3 months, depending on whether or not the offer was an appeals or if we were just able to get it accepted during our first round. The lien release comes, and it is as if you paid it in full, even though you did not. And then, how to win an offer in compromise? Well, that's a bit long of a story, and that would be the subject of not more than just one webinar, but that is an art form of itself. Now I want to talk about old tax liens. Okay, remember I said stale dated? That's the term, that the liens are so old and that they passed that date that says last date to refile, that the liens never got paid off. Now, how is that possible? Liens never get paid off. Well, the IRS has a limited amount of time to collect on any tax debt. Tom, maybe you could throw up that link to the blog, the latest one I did on the CSEDs, so people, looking for more about exactly how this works. Very often, a lien will expire before it's paid off. So it's still showing that nothing has been done with it, and it's still there on the land records. But believe it or not, it's no longer value. It's no longer valid. And if you wanted to clear this up, to say the IRS has no debt against you, okay? Because at this point, once the IRS loses the ability to collect on a debt through the passage of time, okay, that debt is zero. You'll look at your account transcript, you'll see it's zero. Hey, and then you go ask the IRS, hey IRS, will you get rid of this lien because I don't owe any money? They'll say no. Why should we? You didn't pay your taxes in full. We're just going to let it sit there, and that's sort of how it works. Now, let's say that you have an old lien on there that's also stale dated, but it was one that you did pay, or even if you got a release. Let's say you got a release for one that you paid in full, but it's on the land records, and it's showing up on your credit report. There's a lien there, lien release. Guess what? The IRS has a new program. If you have an old lien you paid off, you can get it withdrawn. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, because the withdrawal will show up as a lien never been filing against you. When someone pulls your credit report, they're not going to see federal tax lien filed, federal tax lien release. They're going to see nothing there. And so that's just a nicer little, cleaner way, especially if you're going to go for, a pretty big job or something like that, and you just don't want any mark against you. That's a nice little thing that you could do. Who you deal with, and obviously at this point you don't have a case open anymore. The persons that you deal with is technical services, and they handle the vast majority of all the lien work. And just as an aside, our technical services we're based in Connecticut. Our technical services is in Boston, and there are just some fantastic people who work there. But with the IRS vastly increased the lien filing, and the technical services lost some people through attrition, and so they're operating, I think, somewhere around 70% of capacity of where they were 5 years ago, and they have more than double the workload. Whereas it would take me about a week or so to get a lien withdrawn. Now it's looking like 4 or 5 weeks. That's really the delay they're under. So whenever you think you're going to sell a property or you want to get some lien work, just be aware of the time. It's not like it used to be. And again, nothing against the people at Technical Services. They all do know their law very, very well. There's just some big delays because the IRS hasn't allocated the resources that they should have. And now with this year, we're looking at some sequester. You could bet that these are some of the first people to be forced to take time off. So the IRS shutting down isn't always a great thing, or actually is never a great thing. Now I just want to start to wrap up my conclusion here. Okay, and one of the things you need to know is the IRS rarely forecloses on a lien. They just file the lien. Whether you have equity or whether you don't, and at one point the IRS was filing liens for so low they would actually lose money on the deal. And I have a blog. Tom, maybe you could search for that blog entry there and put that in there. The IRS actually would file where it cost the IRS more money to record it than it did in how much was actually owed. And they did stop that, so they backed off a little bit. But it's still just ridiculous that, I really think a lien should be as a last resort. That somebody, somebody has, that there's identifiable assets that could pay the debt off in full, and the person decides not to liquidate them. In that case, it makes sense for the IRS to issue a tax lien. But in the vast majority of cases where people owe money to the IRS, it just doesn't. It makes everyone's life more miserable, and it makes the collection of the debt far less likely. I don't understand why they're doing it. And it's like, I'm trying to think, do you think you're going to intimidate people into paying? As most people, you're already intimidating enough. And just, handcuffing someone that doesn't really give them the ability to, send you money they don't have. But what you do need to know is that tax liens can be dealt with as long as there is an overall solution in place. That you just can't, wait. No one can wave a magic wand, except in the case, I guess, of the lien withdrawal after full payment. But in these cases, you just can't wave a magic wand and expect, a miracle to happen. There has to be something in it for the IRS to get some understanding on tax liens. And now at this point, I will go and make a plug. Here is our shameless plug of self-promotion. Just let you know that Parent and Parent LLP IRS Medic is a boutique tax resolution firm. We have clients from all over the world. We are flat fee based, so you don't have to worry about hourly billing, and we handle the toughest cases around the country, and I should change that to around the world. There are U.S. taxpayers around the world, don't you know? And if you are a CPA, enrolled agent, or other attorney struggling with a tax lien issue, please give us a call. We'll see if we can help you out. Here's our general email, info@irsmedic.com, and anything you tell us is 100% confidential, or you may call us at 888-IRS-HALT. That's 888-477-4258. That wraps it up. This is